Can I thank SPRU for inviting me? This place has been, they don't know this, but this place has been one of the major influences on my career. I started reporting on the environment about 30 years ago, something like that, and came across SPRU. In those days, they were hardly ever mentioned in the media. Energy was hardly ever mentioned in the media. I think people in it, Jim, were regarded as rather eccentric, perhaps, sort of definitely nerdy. And I was looked at in the office as something of an oddity. And now I am delighted to say that energy is centre stage, sometimes rather too centre stage for comfort. And there are loads of good people reporting on it now. So the landscape has massively changed, partly due to many circumstances, but partly due to the fantastic work of this institution. I think I should say that. Jim hasn't paid me extra to make that point. We're facing, of course, as we all know, a global trilemma. The trilemma, I think, is an English phrase, with prices, energy security, and carbon emissions. It's not just pertaining to the UK, it's pertaining to everyone, of course, and we're at a time of massive system upheaval. So I was talking last night, for instance, to a senior civil servant at Bees, the new business department, and he was saying, oh, well, you know, whatever happens in the future, we're going to have to get lots more conventional generation on the system and, you know, pumping stuff into the grid in the traditional way. And I pointed out to him the words of an academic in Newcastle, Phil Taylor, Professor of Electrical Systems in Newcastle, who makes the point that with the inevitable advent of electric cars onto the system in the UK, we would need to renew the entire grid to carry the amount of power that will be needed when electricity is used variously to heat our homes and drive our cars, as well as to keep our lights on and charge our computers. And Phil has calculated that you would need enough cable to stretch to the moon and back in order to renew the energy system, electricity system. And that clearly is not going to happen. Therefore, there is clearly a massive disruption ahead, although it seems that not everybody in crucial positions has realized that yet. We are at such a time of upheaval. Last night, the new climate change minister, Nick Hurd, who has a very long track record in being an environmentally minded MP, said he might have to postpone the UK's long-delayed carbon plan, already delayed by a year. He may have to postpone it to next year because it's so complicated and so many things are up in the air. And that's with a background of Nick Stern saying, look, this is urgent, this is urgent, urgent, urgent. And yet the government, and I think some people, you know, would find it hard to blame them because the issues are so tricky with Hinckley still in play and so much uncertainty about other things. The government can't even make a decision, even though it is committed to making a decision. So I could talk for some time about this, but I'm not going to because there are three people better qualified than me. And fewer better qualified than Jim Watson, who's going to kick off today. Then we're going to hear from the other guys, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Roger, and hopefully we won't have the feedback with my mic. We'll listen out for that. So thanks to Roger for chairing, and to Kelly and to Wolfgang as well for coming over to join us for this session. It's very much focused on international developments, but really through looking at through that lens at three different countries, if not more than three, and how they're dealing with some of these changes and energy challenges. We've already had a flavour of some of the challenges from Nick Stern in his lecture, and I'll try and pick up some of the themes from his remarks and Johann's remarks and what I'm going to say, mainly about the UK, but also UK's relationship with the world, and indeed, particularly the EU at the moment is particularly important. I mean, in UK policy, I guess my overwhelming soundbite is the sense of uncertainty. And it's not just because of Brexit and what that might mean, but it's also because we've had a change in government and this merger of the energy department into the business department, and the change that means in terms of where energy sits in the decision-making process in the UK government. I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. And actually, it connects it much more closely to some of the things that Nick Stern was talking about in terms of thinking about energy systems in terms of industrial policy and industrial strategy, and not just in terms of security, climate mitigation, and cost, the trilemma that Roger referred to. Those challenges very much remain the same for the UK government. I think over the last few years, the order of the objectives has shifted. So sadly, the climate change objective no longer has primacy in the way that perhaps it had for the previous 5 to 10 years. There's much more emphasis now on costs to consumers and industry and to security. But certainly the addition of industrial strategy helps. And it sort of brings us into line in the UK with a number of other countries. When I go internationally and say, oh, we don't really think about industrial strategy as part of energy policy, many colleagues in other countries think that's a bit weird. So perhaps bringing those two things together is bringing us more into line with where the others are. I think there are big questions also about what industrial policy and industrial strategy is going to mean. We in this audience, in this room, many of us have spent a long time thinking that through, trying to understand how you do it. I think for some politicians, there are rather simplistic understandings. So one MP from the governing party I spoke to soon after the merger said, well, it means just getting Hinkley C off the ground, a giant nuclear power station and the jobs it's going to create in his constituency. That is industrial policy. So I think we've got quite a long way to go if that's typical. I will be positive about where the UK is to some extent. I don't think it's entirely problematic. So we do still have, despite all the uncertainty of Brexit and everything else, world-leading climate legislation, our Climate Change Act from 2008. Our emissions of greenhouse gases have been steadily falling since the Act came into force, indeed before it. 34% reduction in greenhouse gases between 1990 and 2014. So we're going to meet our interim targets for the first decade or so. The other good story for the UK is that renewable electricity has grown very strongly at last in the last few years. So we're now 25% of our power comes from renewable sources, up from about 3% in the year 2000. So we were frankly embarrassing for many, many years if you compare us to international partners, both here in Europe and elsewhere. We're now just perhaps laggards. So we've upgraded ourselves from embarrassing to laggards. But we've done relatively well. What we're still very poor on is getting that renewable resource and low carbon resource into other areas of the energy system, particularly heating and transport, and that's where we've got a lot of work to do. I think another point I'd point to is that some of the political change in the UK, the decentralisation of policy, means we've actually got more activism in some of the devolved administrations. The Scottish government, which I interact with a lot, is actually much more ambitious in some of the things it wants to do on cleaner energy. And the other point, in common with a number of other mature economies, is our demand for energy has actually fallen fairly consistently over the last decade, so since about 2005. Nobody really understands why in detail. We know it's got something to do with industrial restructuring, something to do with policy, something to do, of course, with the financial crisis of 2008. Again, these systemic issues, but actually pinning down exactly what's happening is difficult. And that's something the centre I spend most of the time directing, the UK Energy Research Centre, is looking at the moment. But of course, there are many negatives. Our decarbonisation strategy, as Roger alluded to, is late. It's got a lot of holes in it. There's a lot of areas of policy where there's the absence of policy. The government's advisors say, actually, if we're going to meet our targets over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we need to plug those holes. And there are some wrong turns. So politicians have decided in their wisdom we're not going to have the cheapest low-carbon option on the agenda anymore. That's onshore wind, because some constituents don't like it. We've got a big hole in energy efficiency policy, which to me is a no-brainer, both in terms of helping low carbon, security, but also fuel poverty, which is all too prevalent. And I think the jury's out in a number of other areas. I mean, one, again, Roger mentioned this idea of a smarter power system. This is where some of these long waves that Chris Freeman was very famous for analysing and diagnosing. Nick Stern showed the graph earlier on. For many years, the power sector and the energy sector generally was really untouched by this wave of innovation from ICTs. That is really now starting to happen. But I think now you see a real divergence in thinking in certainly the discussions I have in the UK, with industry, with government. Some still cling to the old ways of thinking about things. So to have a power system that works, we need conventional generators that are powered by coal and gas. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart. But yet, there is this strand of thinking which is increasingly strong that says, actually, we can do things smarter, the Phil Taylor point that Roger mentioned. ICTs, new business models, storage, electric vehicles. There's a whole set of things which make a system which might be completely different. Places like California are leading the way, and the UK is not far behind. But in some cases, it seems that civil servants have not yet got the memo that that is an alternative way of doing things. And they actually have to do things institutionally to set incentives to get this going. Bits of government have got it. There was a great report from a what I can only assume is a revolutionary cell within our finance ministry called the National Infrastructure Commission about smart power. But actually, that was really very different to the very conventional way of doing things. And basically said you could save lots of money by using these smarter approaches. I think linked to that in security terms, that is reflected in that debate. We still have this debate about whether the lights will stay on every winter. Of course, they are today. I'm relatively relaxed. I think the policies are in place. But again, there's a divergence of opinion about what you do. You know, the old way says more conventional power. The new way says actually you can use demand, you can use ICT and new business models to help solve the problem. I think the other area where it's interesting, we've really embraced, or at least the UK government has embraced, is mission innovation, and that speaks to the international context here. The big coalition that came out in Paris, which is now starting to see some flesh on its bones. I'm pleased to see the UK as a leading light in that, but there have been some rather weird decisions about our innovation priorities in the UK, for example, on small modular nuclear reactors, which may have a role in future, but the evidence base really wasn't there to support it taking half of our R&D budget for energy over this 5-year parliamentary period. So I found that rather strange. So we are being deeply affected by international developments. I've mentioned innovation, and I think that's very important, but also fossil fuel prices. I think one thing which any national government needs to do is to take into account possible changes in international fossil fuel prices. Many were taken by surprise by the falls over the last few years because of events in the US, which we may hear more about in a minute. But a lot of policies were based on high fossil fuel prices, and many of them began to look a lot more expensive after prices fell. Now we are in low fossil fuel prices, and I think it would be an equal mistake to assume they will stay low forever. So I'm always pleading with civil servants to make sure they stress test their policies for both outcomes. I'm going to end my remarks with just a few comments about Brexit and what that might mean. The obvious thing to say is that we don't know, and that seems to be the official government policy as well. The policy statement the other day from UK government on our strategy for Brexit is that it means Brexit, and then it was rather a full stop and a pause. For our area, clearly that uncertainty is damaging in itself. So the fact that we might have changes to our membership of the single energy market in the EU could have impacts on our prices, on security, and a number of other areas. Those well-functioning markets, in my view, are very important. But also for innovation and innovation policy. Many of us in UK universities are very concerned about the role of funding for innovation, and that is definitely true for energy, which is a very big area for that. I think climate policy itself, it's more mixed in the sense that the UK has been a leader, as I've said earlier. And actually, the EU is losing something from a Brexit as much as we might lose something. So we have been, in the UK, a consistent advocate for stronger action. That's been balanced by other member states in the EU wanting weaker action. I think the EU is going to lose a strong advocate of climate policy. It's also going to lose a strong advocate for markets and for transparency and regulation. And that may, depending on how you interpret that, may also have a bad effect on both the UK and on the rest of the EU. I think in the medium term, one concern is that there's a lack of a break from EU policy on any attempts there might be to undo some of the UK ambition in this area. And I think certainly if we don't make our minds up to have this plan that Roger mentioned and do more, then there's a risk that that climate leadership that the UK has built up with its diplomacy and its investment in talking to the rest of the world, not just the EU, may well be lost in future. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. A couple of things strike me. One is, we have to publish the low carbon plan. If we don't publish it, then we're in derogation of the Climate Change Act, and that's trouble. So it has to come sooner or later. But last night at the same reception at the business department, Greg Clark, the new secretary, spoke extensively about the need for a low carbon economy. He's written papers on it himself. He's extremely interested in it, and he told me he was really looking forward to getting back to what he considers to be, the central interest. So, his enthusiasm is there. However, he didn't talk, although he spoke at length, he didn't give any idea of what the new industrial strategy might mean at all, and particularly in terms of carbon. So can I just put you in his position for a moment, appoint you Secretary of State, and ask you to outline in a minute and a half what your industrial strategy is and what you're going to do about steel jobs in South Wales and that sort of thing.
Thank you for the really nice, easy question. I mean, first thing to say is that the department itself, including both wings that have been brought together, have spent quite a lot of time thinking about this under the radar over the last 5 to 10 years. And actually, they built up quite a good evidence base on, for example, which areas of low-carbon technology are important for the UK in meeting our targets, but also where do we have competitive advantage, where do we have a strong science base and an industrial base. So actually they've got the evidence on that, which is why I made my comments about small modular reactors, because they didn't appear in that evidence base very much. I think they got a small box in probably a 50-page document.
It's called David King, I think.
It may well be. I won't comment on that. But there are a number of areas where I think we do quite well. So in smart grid demonstrations, I think we've led the world in finding innovative ways to do that in offshore wind and so on. We've got leadership both in deployment and in some of the science base. So you can already see the outlines of a strategy where we have a portfolio of technologies. We don't pick winners in terms of pet companies or pet projects, but you actually decide which of the huge range of options you decide to do. You can't do all of the above. I think we have the evidence in some areas where we can do that. I'd also make a plea for including within that demonstrating systems, not just on electricity, but heat. And that's, again, where we've started to do some work. We could do a lot more because the heat is one of the tough problems to crack, not only demonstrating how to do it differently, but getting the incentives for the deployment. And I'll return to that whole in energy efficiency, and that's just a case of, in some cases, deploying very tried and tested familiar things, but also thinking about the business models and how do you bring that together with things like decentralized energy storage. So, my short answer is we have a lot of the evidence. It's bringing that together in a strategy. Yes, they have to do different things and perhaps revisit some of the decisions they've made, but sort of bring some urgency to this as well.
Right, and briefly on energy efficiency, again, I asked the Minister last night, and I made a joke, the new energy minister used to be very high up in Tesco and apparently invented the idea that every Tesco should have a porch for energy efficiency reasons. And I suggested, with tongue-in-cheek, that perhaps that should be a national mandate that every building in the country should have a porch. And she frowned at me and said, I suspect you're a little more pro-rules than I am. And I thought, okay, well, so I said, well, how are you going to achieve energy efficiency? And if you don't bring some rules in place, and she didn't really answer. What would you do?
I think rules are very important. I mean, as a part-time economist, I'd say, economic incentives are absolutely fine if you've got time, but I'd return to Nick Stern's point both on the systemic change, but also the time, the urgency. And if you look at case study after case study, the role of regulation in driving innovation and deployment quickly is very, very important. And if you can do that ahead, that's what a lot of progressive businesses are actually asking for in terms of products or whole house retrofits and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Now going to hear from Kelly Sims Gallagher. She's wrongly labelled on your programme as from the office, the White House Office for Science and Technology. She used to be there, and she told me that she was one of the people behind the US-China deal on climate, which is a fantastic credit to your name. You can go to your grave happy. She's now with Tufts, so give us a feeling of what's happening in the States and internationally.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I'm going to defy you a little bit because I wanted to take advantage of the remarkable luxury, academic luxury of being at SPRU, which is such a treat for me, and reflect a little bit about the intersection between energy, climate, and innovation, perhaps in a little bit more of a theoretical sense, but I'm totally happy to come back and talk about the United States later. And when I think about the connection between all of these issues, and development, where I've done a lot of work as well, I have two fundamental worries, I think, and they're on two different dimensions. One is a time dimension, and the other one is the development dimension. And the time dimension was sort of foreshadowed here by Nick Stern in his talk, which is really this question of, do we have time for energy innovation to run its course? We know that innovation takes a lot of time, but we also know we're extremely constrained in terms of the amount of time we have to act and to achieve a very low carbon society. I believe that at this point, we as a macro global society aren't really trying very hard to innovate in this space, in low carbon economy, because the status quo is not all that bad. And that's especially the case in industrialized countries. The good news is we have a lot of existing technologies that can get us pretty far down the path that we need to be going on. But even so, we aren't deploying those technologies nearly to the extent that we could. So from my understanding of the innovation literature, there's really little to no evidence that we can speed up innovation processes. There's much evidence that innovation cannot be hurried except in rare circumstances. And I think there's plenty of evidence that innovation can be slowed down, either deliberately or unintentionally. And that's especially true for complex, interdependent systems where you lack direct substitutes for technologies. So when I think about the energy climate development challenge and how we're trying right now to accelerate innovation and whether we're doing a good job or not, a few recent examples come to mind. One is Mission Innovation, which you just mentioned, which was this pledge of 20 countries to double investments, government investments in RD&D in clean energy. The second one was the announcement of this breakthrough coalition of Bill Gates and his wealthy friends, who would considerably increase the amount of private sector investment in clean energy. And then third, some countries, but not very many, are getting quite serious about market formation, climate policies that will create the market incentive to deploy these technologies. And I would say China stands out for me in this respect as being one of the leaders. But on the other hand, I see a lot of evidence that we're hindering innovation processes in energy technology innovation. One point I'd like to make is that we have a very strong mitigation bias in our sort of innovation attention and effort, and a relative strong neglect of innovation for adaptation and resilience. And that worries me a lot because I think it is inevitable. We will have considerable climate change at this point. We also have a very strong energy supply side bias and a relative neglect in our innovation effort of the end use side, the efficiency side. I think we have an industrialized country bias and a relative lack of focus on developing countries. We continue to fund R&D in conventional fuels and technologies, plus we continue to directly subsidize fossil fuels. We probably have quite a lot of redundant funding across countries and firms because we don't do a good job of sharing with one another what we're doing and partnering. We certainly lack coherent and consistent market formation policies in many key countries, and the United States is a good example of that. We have powerful incumbents combined with a pretty astonishing amount of apathy, even though we just passed, or reached the Paris Agreement, which was supposed to be this landmark agreement, but I see very few countries rushing to get, domestic national climate policies in place. And that's related to my final point about how we hinder our energy innovation system, which is the very slow pace of international negotiations on climate change. So when I think about how we can better manage energy innovation systems in an uncertain world, which was the topic of the panel, I first draw the distinction between mitigation and adaptation, because I actually think uncertainty is very great for adaptation. It's very hard to think about what the conditions are in very specific locations that you're designing for or innovating for. But on the other hand, from a mitigation point of view, we actually have a lot of certainty about the direction we need to be moving from an innovation point of view. So these are quite straightforward: more efficiency, cleaner technologies that are tailored to national circumstances. And those do differ. And I think we need to do a better job of thinking about different national circumstances and what types of technologies will be suitable in different parts of the world. I also think we need to emphasize more business model innovation, and there's a lot of exciting work that's been done on business model innovation kind of at the base of the pyramid for renewable energy deployment in developing countries. And I would also say behavioral innovation and how we stimulate people to behave differently. So a few final comments. First, I note political will does not seem to be steady or predictable, and the efficacy of policies is really far from clear. Our policies to stimulate energy innovation for any of our public goods. And that, of course, muddies the waters for the private sector to respond to these conflicting, inconsistent incentives. And it certainly doesn't create fire in the belly of entrepreneurs. So for me, where I'm turning a lot of my attention is trying to start doing much more research on which climate policies work, which don't, and why, in which circumstances, in general, and also specific to the kind of climate innovation agenda. And we've just established a climate policy lab at the Fletcher School that's going to be working exactly on this topic, because I think we need to start being much more empirical in determining what's working and what isn't working from a policy point of view. I also think we ought to be advocating more of a purposeful, experimental approach by governments. Try policies out, see how the market responds, modify, learn by doing. We really need to do this in policy. We don't adapt our policies very well. And if something fails, it's lost forever, as we've learned in the United States. And then my final point is that I think one of the most exciting places to look at emerging climate policy and energy and climate innovation is in the developing world and developing markets. And I'm starting to believe that we might see more innovation there because these countries are leveraging the globalized markets, which is something I've done a lot of work on in past research. There's less lock-in, more opportunity, fewer incumbents, and more diversity. So all of these have good innovation characteristics. And I think that many of these countries are truly looking for that zero carbon growth path, or at least a pathway to sustainable prosperity.
Okay, thank you very much. A few provocations there. Firstly, can I just challenge you on the you can't hurry innovation? I'm thinking back to the moonshot and sort of wondering if you're thinking, well, if you can't hurry innovation, does it not matter whether you spend, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, 10 billion? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. And what evidence, you're talking about empirical evidence, right. What evidence do you have that you can't stimulate, you can't hurry innovation?
Well, I don't think we have very much evidence in energy in this regard. We have evidence that the moonshot is the common example, and there were very different characteristics to the moonshot mission. You had a buyer who didn't care about cost and who was certain to purchase the technology. You had a very focused single mission, which is not the case here either. Another example people often use is the innovation that occurred around World War II in a lot of different industries. And again, there was a sense of national or international will and mission. And I'm asserting that we lack those things still today. And so it might take, as Vernon Rutan said, it might take a war to stimulate this kind of focused attention. But I also don't think but I would welcome comments from all of the smart people in this audience. I don't think we have a strong evidence base that you can hurry up energy technology innovation. We have some examples. We can look back retrospectively and say innovation appeared to occur fairly frequently, or you know, the cost of certain technologies came down more rapidly than we expected prospectively. But those were not things that were intentionally achieved.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's hear now from Wolfgang Eichhammer from the Fraunhofer Institute. Got some troubles in Germany, just as we have in the UK.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having invited me for here. It's really an honor here to speak here at the University of SPRU. And I know SPRU for much time, in fact for 25 years, and my institute has a relationship with SPRU for 30 years. And strangely enough, I think it was SPRU that opened us to the European level. By the time we were very much national focused. And through the work with SPRU, we became Europeans in a way. So it's a bit strange to say it here. But it is the truth. And I think it's a good way to look forward. But let me nevertheless look shortly back to the birth of SPRU. I know when you are 50 and beyond, as me are, you don't like so much to look to anniversaries, but a few seconds should be allowed. At that time, I was a boy by the time, I read with much interest about nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. That was really something that inspired me. Later on, I studied physics, so that must have been at the origin, somehow reading those books. Energy was consumed, no one was asked how, and it was going to grow forever. Some of you may remember some of these projections from the time, and when you compare to today's consumption, it's incredible what kind of projections were carried out by the time, and not considering saturation effects and structural changes. Energy was cheap as sand was, or even cheaper at a point in time. And a little bit later on, when I was already starting to work on PV, I remember world level production of PV was 50 megawatt, and a huge plant in France produced 1 megawatt in a year. So that was really tremendous, large production by the time. So that was a bit the time where SPRU started, and you emphasized that you started before the 1973 oil price shock, and my own institute is only 44 years old. But we started also 1 year before the first oil price shock with energy. So we are a bit in the same league, hopefully, but not totally, I must admit. Now, what has changed since then, and it has already been touched in some of that what Kelly and Jim said. Now I take deliberately a German and European perspective. First of all, looking at energy consumption and primary energy consumption in particular, we have largely uncoupled the economic growth from energy consumption, and I think this is a huge achievement. It was technological change, naturally, who has driven that, but it was also a large number of policies. Kelly said, yeah, we haven't been doing enough, and that is true, but we have doing a lot already in that field, and IEA rightly says energy efficiency is the first fuel we have. Just to point to one policy is in the building sector, nearly zero energy buildings that are to come by 2020. New buildings are consuming 10 times less and more than they used to consume when I was young. That is a huge achievement of policy. As a corollary, it's not only primary energy, there are also sectoral progress, like for example in Germany we have uncoupled economic growth from transport energy demand for quite some time now, but not fast enough. There are signs that electricity demand is starting to uncouple, is saturating or maybe even decreasing despite some economic growth. Statistically spoken, it's not yet something where you can be fully sure and you have good stable evidence there. Looking to the second large achievement, I would say, is the renewable energy sources. Germany is now at 33% of renewable energy sources in the power sector, mostly fluctuating. 15 years ago, we used to have between 3 and 5%. It was hydropower mainly. And that shows how tremendously fast this innovation can go on. And also, what was very important was the policy change. We started with a relatively simple feed-in tariff scheme, and this scheme, I can't now enter into details, has evolved a lot in the direction of bringing renewables closer to the market, feed-in premiums, tender systems that on the one hand should, as said, bring renewables closer to the market, but on the other hand, should also protect the innovation as it has been protected during the last 15 to 20 years. Costs have been coming down, it was mentioned already, and to be honest, while we should do things efficiently, I think costs are largely overestimated when it comes to climate change. My own annual contribution to German transformation of the energy system is of 200 or 300 euro annually, and this is about the range I pay for health insurance or other nice things, or when I buy a nice new car with some nice new features. All this is in range what I can afford, and you should pay a bit attention that some poorer categories of the population, for them 300 euro is something to deal with, but with a larger part of the society, they can handle this type of cost, and I think this was a very important view in Germany, that a country can handle those costs, and that contributed to lower the costs for the rest of the world in the field of photovoltaics. Now looking forward to the policy changes, and I think this is the most interesting part, because this is the work we are going to do, and what has been achieved is past. In fact, again, pointing to the electricity sector, which is the heart of our efforts, but heat, as was pointed out, is also important. The keyword there is providing enablers of flexibility. I said that Germany has reached 33% of renewables, and with a fairly classical electricity system. When I was a bit younger, I was told electricity system cannot handle more than 10% of renewables, and then it will break down. Now we are at 33%, and the system is still very, very traditional and conventional. But now we have to head in the next 20 years for 55%, and this is something new. The system needs to change. And there are 4 fields where we need to innovate. On one hand, on the interaction between technology and system, this touches about things like energy sector coupling, like demand response and load management, like the interconnections, the regional flexibility, or the technology mix. The second field where we have to innovate is about technology and markets, and this means a redesign, a careful redesign, not a revolution, but a careful redesign of electricity markets, providing the right incentives for the functioning of the markets, for investments, but also for the environmental purposes. And let me just point to the carbon markets, which in Germany, in Europe in general, are so far at odd and really need repair to provide the right signals. The third field where we need innovation is technology and society, and this is about acceptance by the public. And here I must say, in Germany, it was relatively easy to have this acceptance by the people, which is rather different by other countries, I must admit, but which is also the consequence about a relatively homogeneous voice among all the policymakers, independent of the political color. The second point here in technology and society is about the development of large stakeholders. I mean, some of you may know, when you look at, for example, German electricity suppliers, I'm not sure that they would invest in the shares of companies like RWE or E.ON. They have been a very good investment some years ago, but today they face a very difficult environment. And I think this should be a signal for energy companies working in other fields like oil, coal, and nuclear, that there are a lot of changes coming for them. And the final field where we need innovation is about technology and policy. As I already pointed to the need of a kind of common vision across national governments. I think this is very important because you need a bit time, as Kelly pointed out. And second, also within Europe, we need a more common view. And this is where we, I think, have still very different visions of what is feasible. And we also have different visions of what is the contribution of different energy sources like coal and nuclear in particular. International context, I think, is, in my view, rather favorable. Paris Agreement was mentioned. Renewables are kicking off worldwide. They have overcome, in terms of investments, the fossil fuels. The financing streams are increasingly deviated from fossil fuels to renewables. And we have the strong role of countries like China, as Kelly pointed out here, but not only the big giants, also countries, for example, in Northern Africa. I'm often in Morocco. 10 years ago, they told me when we talked about renewables, well, you Germans, you are rich, you can afford for that. But when I come today to Morocco, they have understood that renewables are a need for them. It's not a luxury, it's a need. This country has no oil and gas resources. So, in my view, there's a lot of scope for optimism. I think maybe that's a bit the German perspective, because I think we have a lot of skilled engineers. They can do a very good job here. We have not given up engineering, as our British friends sometimes. We have a concerned population still, and I hope this can be kept. Also, we know that these things can change, are fragile. And we have a steady policy innovation asset across the governments. I think these were very important ingredients and provide for me a lot of hope that we can do our changes. And finally, well, I think this change must be accompanied by analytical capabilities, but also by driving as forerunners the developments. And I think SPRU did a very excellent job in that sense. And so I wouldn't engage the next 50 years, that's hard to say. I would at least engage the next 20 years that SPRU is going to be very active in that field, and good wish for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, I think we all actually owe the Germans a great debt with your rather quixotic decision to invest in solar power in rather unsunny Germany. It's a massive gift that you have given to the planet in terms of tumbling solar prices, and I think probably Germany has not received the credit it deserves from that. But just you know, your sense of optimism now, I just want to just probe it a little, because we've just had a G20 summit at which the US and China triumphantly announced that they were going to ratify the Paris deal, but then we saw the G20 fail to set any time for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, so we're still pushing all economic incentives in the wrong direction. And I wonder where your optimism comes from.
I think one shouldn't look too much to the big policy all the time, because it's very difficult to get something in common across all nations. But when you look at the policies that countries are doing, I mean, you mentioned China. If you look to the Chinese policy, how much steps they are taking, for example, in the direction of renewables, how much they, in particular, policymakers talk about the environment, talk about energy issues. And I think these signals are very important also for the mind-making of the people. If policymakers always say it's not possible, then it's not going to be possible. But if they emphasize that this can be done, and to be frank, you pointed to the moon landing. When I was a boy, this was very impressive that this was possible. So doing something for climate change in 40 or 50 years, let's say 35 years to the middle of the century, should be possible in the same manner, despite all the differences you pointed.
Wasn't the moon landing a hoax? It was a hoax. Okay, let's take some quick questions and answers. Who's going to do a microphone for me? So I'm going to have to keep hold of this one. Can we just do this side first? Let's take a couple of quick questions. We're very short of time because of the various difficulties starting off. Any questions or comments this side? No? Okay. This bank here. Any questions or comments in this bank? Questions or comments in this bank? Okay, I'll ignore that bank, you're too slow. This bank over here, we'll start with the gentleman there, and then there's a gentleman at the back who's achievable. So if you could keep it very tight, I'd be grateful.
Sure. Jeff Hardy from Imperial College. So you've all talked briefly about business models, disruptive business models. I was just wondering, if you were to look to the future, do you see a traditional energy utility in the future of, say, 30 or 40 years hence? Or do you see something quite different? And if so, what?
Okay, thank you. It's very succinct. And there's a gentleman at the back, at the edge with a mauve shirt, and then there's another man further back, right at the far back.
Thank you. It's just a very quick question. It's really around politics and the nature of struggle. So the crisis in South Africa in terms of its renewable industry at the moment is really orchestrated by the Russians and their intervention in respect of nuclear energy. And the question really is there not an element of naivety in the conversations that we have within these policy groups which ignores politics, it ignores the nature of politics and the way in which people take decisions, and there's insufficient attention to how power can be used by internationally and by stronger countries in the way in which they can intervene in these markets. So
Okay, thank you. And then gentleman far back.
Hi, I'm John Paul Skeet from the University of York. I just wanted to push back just a little bit on the proposal that innovation can't be hurried. Just to give an example, in 2009, the European Union set CO2 standards for road vehicles, and first target was 2015, and that has widely been credited as a technology forcing policy and credited for the removal of lead out of petrol. I mean, I was still around when we still had like leaded or unleaded petrol, and also the invention of the catalytic converter. So for me, that's an example, a pretty solid example of technology forcing policy that can be achieved.
Okay, let me hand the microphone to you to pick that one up, Kelly. You suggest that you can force technological advance.
Yeah, so maybe I was being a little too broad when I used the term innovation, because of course there's many examples like that, where there are many examples, and I myself have done a lot of work on the automobile industry, fuel economy standards and pollution standards. And while I would say I agree with you that policy can have this forcing effect, very often the lack of it hinders the innovation. And my first book, my doctoral work, was on the development of the auto industry in China. And the fact that even though the catalytic converter had been invented 30 years before, it was not being used, even as late as 2000 in China, because there was no incentive for it to be put into production in the Chinese market. There was no policy incentive. So don't get me wrong, I'm very strongly in favor of a coherent, strong policy incentive. That's what I meant when I said we need those market formation policies, and I do think there can be a quick response, but I'm thinking of the full spectrum of invention through global deployment of technologies. In fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that does take time, which is why what I'm trying to argue is we need to stop hindering the process. Like, we at least know all the things we're doing wrong, and we could stop doing those and then do what we can to try and accelerate it, even though I am positing that we don't really have a lot of evidence about how to hurry it up.
Thank you. I'll make a brief comment. In China, I was in China about 20 years ago, I guess, when they were just embarking on a major road building program into cities. And the Labour government, under John Prescott, has determined that there should be no more major road building into cities because it just stimulated more traffic, caused more pollution and jammed up cities. And I mentioned this to my translator, who used to work for People's Daily. And he said, would you write an op-ed for People's Daily? I thought, crikey, op-ed for People's Daily? Yes. So I wrote my op-ed, he translated it, he said it had gone down very well, it would appear next day. I picked up next day's paper, it wasn't there. I said, what happened? He said, oh, someone didn't like it. So I think, could I ask you, Jim, with reflecting that, to pick up the suggestion that we are rather naive about the use of power, use and misuse of power?
Yeah, we can be. I think you're right. But I don't think you can study this field without being attention to politics. And actually, the point in answer to Roger's challenge earlier about industrial policy, which I didn't cover, was the winners and losers. And that's another way that these things get expressed through politics. So I'm increasingly interested in my centre on distribution of winners and losers. So we talk about the transition as a very aggregate thing, and it can lead us to be slightly lazy about politics. But actually, when you look at the patterns of whether it's innovation, jobs, or who gets to do most mitigation, who gets to pay, and is that fair, then you start to unpick some of those tensions, which could lead to things that actually, as Kelly puts it, will slow things down. So I think the politics are extremely important, and I think any enlightened government or even local authority or international agreement really has to pay attention to that. And it takes a lot of strength to basically confront it, and frankly, you probably have to buy off some interests in order to be able to make progress overall for the benefit of everybody.
Okay, thank you. Wolfgang, would you pick up the question asking whether anything we recognise now as an energy utility will still be in operation in decades to come?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And to be honest, it's very hard to answer from the present perspective, because we do not know exactly whether the system will evolve in a more decentralized and more democratic energy system, or still a relatively centralized system, even if there are a lot of renewables, for example, there. I mentioned the German utilities, and I think this morning it was said that if an organization is permanently in, or more or less often in crisis, it is prepared to change, and when it is not, it's hard to cope with the changes, and the energy providers have been in a very quiet corner for decades, and this is a difficult starting point, I would say. So for the moment, I'm not totally sure that they can make it independent from the question how this future system would look like. They would have much more chances if it would be a more centralized system. In a decentralized system, they have to reinvent totally their business model and to face a lot of competition. So the very good times, I think, for energy providers are over. That is the electricity side, but oil and gas is surely to come also.
Thank you. We have to draw this session to a close in a moment. I think there's time for one more question. If there's a microphone, where's the microphone person? So the woman here caught my eye earlier. So, Madam, you have the last shout. Make it a brief one.
I appreciate the opportunity.
And
Marilyn
potent.
Brown from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. I have a question for Wolfgang Eichhammer. I was interested to see your estimate of a 200 to 300 euro average carbon budget for a German household. There's an emerging literature on the capacity of households and industries to reduce carbon. So I was wondering, though, isn't in your case perhaps it might come down to a question of financing in terms of energy efficiency? If you have low-income households who only have a small capacity, couldn't that capacity be expanded enormously if, for instance, the electricity industry itself were to provide on-bill financing or some of the other innovative financing tools? So how do you decompose that carbon budget concept?
Very briefly, I mean, I was talking about the additional costs that we are facing, notably with respect to renewables, because energy efficiency in large degrees is an investment question, but it is paying off, so we need to organize properly these investments to make it possible. While for renewables, so far, it was really additional costs, and this made the 300 euro that I was talking about, and this will be with us for a few years more. As you may know, I mean, the renewables costs have been coming down. They will not build up anymore, but we have to carry this burden for a few years more. And I think that hinders a bit, let's say, maybe some investment solution for energy efficiency, because we can't increase more the burden on the households, even the wealthy ones like me.
Thank you very much. I need to wrap up this session now. I've really enjoyed it. We've got another hour to chat, really, haven't we? But I have to finish by 1, and we're just beforehand. Can I invite you to thank the panel, and also particularly to thank the wonderful German government for their quixotic gesture, which has brought solar prices tumbling worldwide, a great gift to the planet. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.